Yeah, I'm working on it.
I think you turned it down. You turned it down. You turned it down. Yeah. You turned them down, right, Wayne? Yeah. The other one's facing the wrong way, I think.
What about the end of this one? That's fine.
I know it.
Now, let's see.
Coming down. Good evening. I'm Alex Jones. I'm director of the Joan Shorenstein Center on the Press, Politics, and Public Policy, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you to one of the great events of the year for the Shorenstein Center, and that is the Theodore H. White Lecture. The Shorenstein Center was created here at the Kennedy School in the mid-1980s, and it was created as a memorial to Joan Shorenstein. Joan Shorenstein was a journalist for CBS, television journalist, and a very serious woman when it came to politics and policy and journalism. She died far too young of breast cancer, and her father, Walter Shorenstein, chose to memorialize her by creating the Joan Shorenstein Center on the Press, Politics, and Public Policy. Marvin Kalb was the first director, and I am the second, and I would ask you, if you would please, to join me in a round of thankful applause for Walter Shorenstein, who is here. The Theodore White Lecture was created as a tribute to Teddy White, a reporter's reporter, a historian's historian, and a real Horatio Alger. I didn't really realize this until relatively recently. He was literally like a Horatio Alger. I mean, starting as a paper boy in his newspaper career and had a newsboys scholarship to Harvard College. He went to Time, he covered East Asia, he did a foreign correspondence route, but then in the late 1950s, he really found his true calling, which was presidential politics. And he really changed the whole landscape of what we consider to be appropriate political reporting, campaign reporting especially, with the publication of The Making of the President in 1960. He also did The Making of the President in 1964, 68, 72. Lyndon Johnson, of course, was part of his meat and potatoes. He also wrote a wonderful book called America in Search of Itself and was one of the early architects of the Shorenstein Center. The thing that marked Teddy White's brand of history and journalism was that he told a very human story, always. His politicians were very, very alive. His son, David White, is here, as is Nancy White Hector, David's mother, and I want to say how happy we are that you are here, and I would ask you to join in a round of applause for the Whites. I also want to offer a special welcome to David Broder of the Washington Post, Jill Abramson of the New York Times, Daniel Shore of NPR, Ernie May, a historian here on the faculty of Harvard, who are going to join Bob Caro tomorrow with me on the 5th floor of the Taubman Building, which is the building just across the courtyard here. We're going to start with breakfast at 8:30, and then at 9 o'clock we're going to talk. And we're going to talk, our point of departure will be Bob Caro's remarks tonight, and then we will range on from there. This is something that includes the people who are in attendance as part of the conversation, and I hope as many of you as possible will join us. I think you'll find it a very, very stimulating group of people. In common with many of you, I have favorite portions of Bob Caro's magisterial biographies of Lyndon Johnson and Robert Moses. The wonder, to me, of the way Bob Caro does his work is that he takes so much time and endless, exacting effort to learn about his subject and then uses his vast writing talent to create a world complete on the page. Bob is from New York. He lives on Central Park West in Manhattan, worked before he became a biographer at Newsday on Long Island, has a retreat in the Hamptons. He's a graduate of Princeton and a Nieman Fellow here at Harvard. He and Ina, his wife and indefatigable researcher and sounding board, celebrate the completion of whatever section of the book they're working on by going to France to eat and drink and visit museums. In other words, Bob Caro is not a country boy. And yet Bob Caro seems to understand what he called the nauseating loneliness of the world of the Depression-era Texas Hill Country, where the old beyond their years women walked with a permanent stoop from carrying countless buckets of water with a wooden yoke across their shoulders. The small homesteads strung out across the prairie made it impractical to bring electricity, so water had to be carried from the well in a grueling treadmill of endless brute toil, straight from the Middle Ages. Lyndon Johnson used all his wiles and persuasiveness and influence, and here's the key word, power, to bring electricity to these people. And the power of Bob Caro is that he makes us understand their world and makes us understand why Lyndon Johnson twisted the rules like a length of soft, flexible rope to do this for them, and makes us understand why they loved him and why they were loyal to him. He was able to work this alchemy because he went there, and Ina went there, and they went back and back and back. Two Yankee strangers who stayed until they felt the place and people in their bones. Bob Caro has been working for over 25 years on what he calls the years of Lyndon Johnson. His first book on LBJ was The Path to Power, then came Means of Ascent, and last year, Master of the Senate. Those 3 volumes constitute over 2,500 pages. And vast as that number may sound, I can assure you that those 2,500 pages represent a distilled and honed version of the story that could easily have been twice that length or more. And even at that longer length, the book would only have represented a part of the knowledge that Bob Caro has assembled about his book and related subjects that have demanded nearly 3 decades of his focused attention. For instance, Master of the Senate contains is a sort of stage-setting platform for the arrival of LBJ, a fascinating tour through the institution of the Senate over the course of American history. It is typical Bob Caro element, not a flourish, not a conceit, an essential to understanding the man and the action that is to come. Frankly, the idea that Bob can get Lyndon Johnson's time in the White House into a single 4th volume, which he says he is determined to do, seems unlikely to me, but few will complain if there's a 5th volume or even a 6th. Bob's first book, The Power Broker, Robert Moses and the Fall of New York, took 7 years of investigation in the face of every obstacle Robert Moses could erect. And Moses was a man of staggering power. The book won the Pulitzer Prize, the Francis Parkman Prize, which is awarded by the Society of American Historians, and would eventually be chosen by Modern Library as one of the 100 best books of the 20th century. He then began work on his magnum opus, The Path to Power and Means of Ascent. Both won the National Book Critics Circle Award. Master of the Senate, which took 12 years, won a 2nd Pulitzer for biography and also the National Book Award. Bob Caro has said that he was never interested in writing biography just to show the life of a great man. His interest, he said, was to use biography as a means of illuminating the times and the great forces that shaped the times, particularly political power. Not surprisingly, his books have been controversial. His portrait of Lyndon Johnson is not the one drawn by some others. It is harsher in some respects and more critical. But Bob Caro's LBJ is always human and vivid and fascinating. And I think it is safe to say that no multi-volume biography of a president has ever been more honored, or an even greater compliment, more read, more debated, more discussed. Teddy White would most certainly have approved this year's choice to deliver the Theodore White Lecture. It is my honor to introduce Robert A. Caro.
Thank you. Thank you all. It's always wonderful to be back at Harvard. I didn't go here as an undergraduate, but I was, as Alex said, a Nieman Fellow here while I was a reporter at Newsday. And it was here that I decided to write my book on Robert Moses. Driving from Back Bay Station today along the river, I suddenly saw a Leverett House across the river, and I remembered vividly exactly where and how I decided to write The Power Broker, and if you don't mind, I'll tell you about that for a minute. Everybody, all the Niemans had a special year when we were Niemans. It was a wonderful program, as it is today. But mine was special in a way a little different from the other people, the other members of the Nieman class. In those days, there were a lot of evening events, dinners, cocktail parties, seminars, talks with people. Ina's mother was very ill that year. She died that year, in fact. So Ina was not here much, and I don't feel like going to things in the evening much by myself. So at that time, each house at Harvard gave the Nieman Fellow an office. There was just a little bare room. I had mine in Leverett House, and I would go there at night and read and think. You know, as a reporter, one thing that you never have time to do is think. When I look back at my 6 years as a reporter, all I remember is running frantically, trying to get one story done after another. But suddenly, what I really had for the first time was time to think about what I had been doing at Newsday. And what I concluded was I didn't really know very much about what I had been doing. I had been writing about politics, more and more investigative stuff about political power, getting more and more interested in political power. I'd won a couple of minor awards, really minor awards, but when you're young and you get an award as a reporter, you really think you're being told that you really are succeeding in explaining to people what you wanted to explain to them, that you really think you know what you're talking about. But what I realized when I was up here, for the first time had a chance to stop and think, was that I had always been assuming as a reporter what I had assumed as a student, that in a democracy, power comes from the ballot box, from being elected, from elected officials. In New York, you would say from the mayor of New York and the governor of New York State, they have the power. But I had already realized as a reporter that this guy, Robert Moses, whose only job titles were things like city planning commissioner or the chairman of various public authorities, had more power than any mayor or governor, more than any mayor and governor combined, and that he had had this power seemingly forever. When I got into the Power Broker, I found that he had actually held this power for 48 years, almost half a century, and that with it, he, not any elected official, had shaped the city in which I had grown up. And I, who thought I knew so much about political power, realized while I was up here, sitting in Leverett House, that I had no idea where Robert Moses had gotten the power to do that. To excuse myself, I might say that no one else knew either. As those of you who have read The Power Broker know, a large part of it came from public authorities. At the time that I did The Power Broker, not only was there not a single book that examined adequately in any depth at all a public authority as a source of political power, there wasn't even a magazine article that did that, as I recall. So I would sit up there and try to think of a way to sell my editors on the idea of doing a very long series explaining Robert Moses when I found out about him. But I realized that I couldn't do it. Gradually, I came to realize that I couldn't possibly do this in the context of a daily newspaper. So I wrote a book proposal after a number of publishing houses said no one will read a book on Robert Moses, something that I did believe at the time. I finally got the world's, what I always are calling the world's smallest advance. I can no longer remember whether I got $5,000, of which they gave me $2,500, or whether I got $10,000, of which they gave me $5,000. But in thinking out what I wanted to find out, because I had for the first time to think about what I had been doing, in thinking out the book, I realized that I didn't really want it to be a biography of Robert Moses. As Alex said, I wasn't interested in writing a biography of a famous man. I didn't want it to be a story of his life. That wasn't what I was interested in. I was interested in his political power, how he got it, how he used it, how he shaped New York with it. That power that had affected so many people. That's what I wanted to write about. That was quite a moment for me in my life. It happened in a little room in Leverett House. And I'm grateful to Harvard for giving me the room and giving me the time to think about it, so it's great to be back here. The only thing that makes being here tonight slightly less great is that I have to be up here speaking. The way things seem to have worked out in America today, if you're a writer, you spend an awful lot of time giving talks. But no matter how many talks I give, I'm still happier writing. I'm always more comfortable sitting at my desk with a typewriter than I am up at a lectern like this. I spoke here last year to the Niemans, and I told a story about how I feel every time I get up to speak. I still, a year later, feel the same way. I still feel like the young rabbi, Jewish like me, who just graduated from rabbinical school, and he's assigned as his first job to be the assistant rabbi at a large metropolitan congregation. And after about a month, the senior rabbi says, next Friday night, you're going to give your first sermon. And the young rabbi says, well, you know, I have to tell you, I get very nervous when I speak in public. Do you have any advice for me? And the older rabbi says, well, you know, you're allowed to have a water glass up there on the pulpit with you, and I find that it helps if I fill it with a very dry martini. So the young rabbi takes the advice, and he gives his sermon, and as soon as he's done, he hurries to the back of the synagogue, and he asks the older rabbi, how do I do? The older rabbi says, well, I have 3 comments to make. First of all, when I told you you could have a water glass up there on the pulpit in front of the entire congregation and fill it with a martini, I didn't mean you should leave the olives in it. He said, second, I suggested you sip the martini at crucial points in the sermon, not drink the entire thing in one huge gulp at the beginning. And 3, David slew Goliath. He didn't beat the shit out of him. Having said that, I'll repeat again that it's great to be back here. You know, Franklin Roosevelt, who went here, of course, once said about, he was very fond of the young Lyndon Johnson. James Rowe, one of Roosevelt's advisors, once explained it to me this way. He said, you know, these were 2 political geniuses. When Roosevelt talked about politics, most people here didn't really understand what he was saying. Lyndon Johnson understood it from the first time they met. Roosevelt was very fond of him, and one time when Johnson had just walked out of the office, and Roosevelt said to Harold Ickes, you know, that's the kind of uninhibited young politician I might have been if I hadn't gone to Harvard. I said the power broker is really about political power, not about Robert Moses. All my books are basically about political power. With Robert Moses, it was urban power. I felt if I could find out where he got the power and how he used it, I would be succeeded in explaining not the trappings of power in cities, but the reality, the real essence, the fundamentals of it. What first caught my eye, my interest about Lyndon Johnson, well, I wanted to try to do the same thing with national power. And what first caught my interest about Johnson were his 6 years, 1955 through the end of 1960, as Senate Majority Leader. And the fact that in the whole 20th century, almost the only time that the Senate worked as the Founding Fathers had intended it to work, by which I mean as a center of governmental energy and creativity and ingenuity, was during that 6-year period when it was led by Lyndon Johnson. When Johnson became leader, the theory, well, it was more than a theory. It was said so often in columns, magazine, and newspaper articles that it was a cliche, was that no one could lead the Senate. One of Johnson's predecessors as Majority Leader, Alben Barkley, said that. No one can lead senators. He said, I have nothing to promise them. I have nothing to threaten them with. But Johnson led the Senate. He controlled it and dominated it. So I felt that if I could find out how he did that, how he made it work, that would be a way of understanding legislative power, not in theory, but in reality. This country, we think so much of political power in terms of executive or presidential power, but of course, I wanted to look at legislative power. When I first thought of Lyndon Johnson's Senate years and what I wanted to do with them, however, what I had in mind was something much shorter than what finally emerged. It got longer and longer and required a whole book by itself. You know, once when Winston Churchill was asked how his biography of Lord Marlborough was coming, he said, "I'm working on the fourth of a projected 3 volumes." I'm not equating myself with Winston Churchill, but at this moment we're in the same boat in that respect. And I guess this talk tonight is in many ways about how I got there. The book got longer and longer because the deeper I went into Johnson's career, the more I realized that there were things about his career and the Senate as a whole that I hadn't really thought were very important and worth much attention, that were really quite important. One of them was his rise to power. Nothing in Lyndon Johnson's career was more remarkable than his rise to power in the Senate. You know, today seniority is important in Washington, but in the 1930s and 40s, it was much more important in all aspects of Washington life than it is today. It was even in people's homes. If you were giving a dinner party in your home, and you had more than one senator there, it was expected that you would seat them, if you were the hostess, away from you in order of seniority. Seniority governed the questioning behind closed doors in executive sessions of the Senate committees. The questioning would literally go from the senior member of the majority party, say it was a Democrat, from the senior Democrat, he'd ask all his questions, then across to the senior Republican, and then back to the second Democrat, et cetera. It governed the selection of offices, parking spaces, etc. As far as speaking, you weren't supposed to speak very much during your whole first term, your whole first 6-year term in the Senate, and you weren't supposed to rise on the floor very much, really at all, during your first 2 years in the Senate. At the end of his first 2 years in the Senate, Lyndon Johnson was the assistant leader of his party. At the end of 4 years, he is the leader of his party. The Democrats are in the minority. He is the minority leader. He is the youngest man ever to be the leader of a party in the Senate. He's only 44 years old. I forgot to look tonight. I was going to look in my book to see what the average age of the previous leaders had been. I think, I may be wrong, it was 61. So he was not only the youngest, but he was the youngest by quite a ways. How did he do it? How did he rise to the leadership so fast? And how, after Lyndon Johnson got the leadership, did he manage to run the Senate so effectively when one of his predecessors had said that? No one can lead them. I have nothing to promise them, and I have nothing to threaten them with. Well, the best explanation of how he did it is a quote not from me, but from Lyndon Johnson himself. I use it as the epigraph of the book. Here is Lyndon Johnson talking about himself, and I think that every phrase in this quote is significant. I do understand power, whatever else may be said about me. I know where to look for it and how to use it. Well, Lyndon Johnson was right in that self-assessment. In this book, he looks for and finds power in places that no one else has thought to look for it. Johnson found things to promise senators. He found things to threaten them. Within the book, I probably identified 20 or 21 different sources of such power. I'll talk about just a couple tonight. One was in a place where no one else had looked for it, the other side of the Capitol. Now, in those days, even more than today, the House and the Senate regarded themselves as sort of rival bodies. There wasn't much cooperation between them. But Johnson realizes as soon as he comes to the Senate in January 1949 that he possesses in the House something that no other senator has, the affection, the love, really, of Sam Rayburn. Title of this talk tonight is Personality and Power. Sometimes I think the more that I learn about power, the more important I find that personalities are in it, the human factor. It's hard today to imagine that there was ever somebody like Sam Rayburn in power. He became Speaker of the House in 1940. He stayed with a couple of breaks when the Republicans were briefly in control. He stayed Speaker until he died in 1961, 21 years. Roosevelt, Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, whoever was president, Sam Rayburn was Speaker. And he ran the House, at least when he was young, until he got old in the last couple of years, as an absolute ruler. You could see, I don't know if any of us, how many people here remember Sam Rayburn. He was a short man, 5'6". He had immense shoulders, huge arms, and a very burly body. He was a man of great physical strength. He had this big, completely bald head that he was always afraid the television lights would shine off and make him look ridiculous. They said of him that nobody can fool Sam Rayburn and nobody can cross him. I came to, he was almost unique in his, not only in the way he ran the house with such absolute power, but in his honesty. After all, when he died in 1961, after all those years in power, his savings totaled $15,000. He would walk through the corridors of the house and people would come running up to him and ask for this assignment or that assignment, or they'd ask for a change in the bill one way or another way, and he'd give them an answer. Someone once said to him, "Don't you need to make notes to remember what you said?" Rayburn said, "If you always say what you mean, you don't need notes to remember what you said." So I came, he had a terrible temper, a fearsome temper. You could see his face grim and unsmiling. People knew when he lost his temper because this deep red flush would rise out of his collar and cover that big bald head. And people were really afraid to rub him the wrong way. One of his assistants, Ken Harding, once said to me, to watch Sam Rayburn walk through the corridors of the Capitol was like watching waves breaking on a stone. If he was in a bad mood, people would hurry to get out of his way. No one wanted to take a chance on antagonizing him. So I came to appreciate Sam Rayburn's power, but I also came to appreciate his loneliness. When he comes to Washington in 1917, he spends weekends driving around Washington and its suburbs. He tells a friend, "I'm looking for a house big enough to hold all my children." Some years later, when he still hasn't had any children, he writes to his sister back in Bonham, "God, what I would give for a tow-headed boy to take fishing." But Rayburn never had a tow-headed boy. He never had a family. He considered himself very inept socially. He once said, "I once tried to tell a joke, and by the time I finished, I was the joke." He didn't like to go to cocktail parties. He felt he couldn't make small talk. With women, he was very, very shy. He married once. The marriage lasted only 3 months. No one knows why. I certainly don't. But he never married again. And he once said, "Loneliness breaks the heart. Loneliness is what consumes people." You know, if you're a speaker during the week, they're always surrounded by people who want something from you. But of course, on weekends, everybody else goes home to their family. What Rayburn did, Rayburn lived alone in an apartment up at DuPont Circle. What he did on weekends was to go down to the Capitol and walk around the Capitol and the streets around the Capitol for a long time with that grim face set and that unsmiling, almost glare, as if he wanted to be left alone, as if he didn't want anyone to come up to him. But I found out better because I interviewed the elderly, well, when I interviewed them, they were elderly men. They were talking about how when they were young men. They would say that sometimes on a weekend, loneliness would get too much for Sam Rayburn, and he'd telephone one of his assistants and tell them to come down to his office because he had something urgent for them to do. They described how they'd go down to the office and they'd watch the speaker sit there behind his huge desk, pulling open one drawer after another, trying to find some excuse for having called the young man down there. Now, when Lyndon Johnson marries Lady Bird and comes to Washington in 1934, they have a small apartment, and almost immediately Johnson invites Sam Rayburn to dinner. He has the entree because Rayburn and his father, Lyndon Johnson's father, had been friends in the Texas House of Representatives years before. Now, Rayburn would go to people's houses for dinner. He would always go once as a politeness if he was asked. He almost never went again. But at this very first dinner in the Johnsons' apartment, a bond, a love, a paternal affection springs up. At first, it's not between Rayburn and Lyndon Johnson, but between Rayburn and Lady Bird Johnson. Those of you who have read my first volume know that Lady Bird Johnson, when she was young, was very different from the poised, gracious, dignified First Lady that we all have come to know. She was terribly shy. She once told a friend that when she was a senior in high school, she had prayed that she wouldn't finish first or second in her class. Because if she finished first or second, she would be valedictorian or salutatorian and have to get up and give a speech at graduation. She said she prayed she would finish third. She said, she told the friend, I prayed that if I finished first or second, I would get smallpox. I wrote she would rather have the scars than have to speak in public. Not only, when Johnson, a few years later, runs for Congress, not only can she not speak for him on the platform, she can't even really be an effective hostess at the receptions. In Texas, they used to call these receptions coffees, where a woman in the district would have other women in to meet the candidate's wife. A friend of hers told me to watch Lady Bird stand on the receiving line at a coffee, with that smile carved on her face as if it was set in stone, was the saddest thing I ever saw. And at that very first dinner, a bond is struck between this fierce but very shy man and this very shy woman. It never goes away. You know, for years, after the Johnsons get their ranch in 1951 in the Pedernales, the only photograph in that big living room of the ranch, the only picture of a human being was of Sam Rayburn, and it was put there not by Lyndon Johnson but by Lady Bird. Just yesterday I was looking, I'm dealing with the presidency now and the assassination, and I'm looking through some pictures, and there's a picture that I'd never seen before of Lady Bird arriving to move into the living quarters of the White House after the assassination. Movers have brought everything else. She is carrying only one thing, a photograph of Sam Rayburn. But the bond extends from Lady Bird to include Lyndon, and Sam Rayburn comes to be very fond of him. And in that same year, 1934, Lady Bird is back in Texas visiting her father, and Lyndon Johnson gets pneumonia, which of course in those days was very serious. Sam Rayburn comes to the hospital and sits beside his bed all night in a straight-backed wooden chair. Rayburn's a chain smoker. He smokes all night. We didn't know then that smoking might not be the best thing for pneumonia. But he's so afraid that if he gets up to brush the ashes away, he'll disturb Lyndon, that he doesn't get up. And Johnson recalls that when he woke up in the morning, the first thing he sees is the mighty speaker sitting there beside the bed with his lapels and his vest completely covered with cigarette ashes. And Lyndon Johnson also recalls that as soon as Sam Rayburn sees he's awake, he gets up and leans over the bed and says, "Now, Lyndon, don't you worry. Take it easy. If you need anything, just call on me." Well, Lyndon Johnson, being Lyndon Johnson, it isn't very long before he calls on Sam Rayburn. A few months later, President Roosevelt announces a New Deal program. It's the National Youth Administration. They're going to have a different state director for each state, and Lyndon Johnson wants to be the state director for Texas. Now, what he is a secretary to a congressman. His administrative experience is zero. There's no reason in the world why anyone is going to put him in charge of an agency that's going to have hundreds of employees and dispense millions of dollars a year. Tom Connolly told his biographer, Tom Connolly was the old Texas senator who was chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, and therefore enough of a power in Washington so that Franklin Roosevelt had to deal with him. Tom Connolly told his biographer, quote, "An amazing thing happened yesterday. Everyone knows Sam Rayburn never asks another man for a favor. But yesterday Sam Rayburn came to my office and asked a favor and would not leave until I granted it. The favor, of course, was that Connolly used his influence with Roosevelt to get the NYA appointment for Lyndon Johnson. Johnson gets the appointment as state director for Texas, and his career is on its way. As those of you who have read my first book know, things didn't always go smoothly between them. And very late in 1939 or early in 1940, I don't remember which, Johnson sees a way to get ahead that involves betraying Rayburn, and he betrays him. Roosevelt's man in Texas, the guy who oversees giving of New Deal contracts and patronage in Texas, has always been Cactus Jack Garner, the vice president. But now Garner has split with Roosevelt, and Roosevelt needs a new man in Texas. The obvious choice is Sam Rayburn, who is then majority leader. But Johnson wants the job for himself, and he persuades Roosevelt that Rayburn is his secret enemy. Actually, no one had been more loyal to Franklin Roosevelt than Rayburn. You know, a lot of legislation, an amazing amount, that we consider Roosevelt's legislation would never have become law if Sam Rayburn hadn't rammed it through the House of Representatives, through a conservative, Southern-dominated House of Representatives. But Johnson persuades Roosevelt that Rayburn is his enemy. He gets the job. He thinks that Rayburn is not going to find out what he's done, but nobody ever fooled Sam Rayburn, and he knows immediately. For 2 years, there's coolness between them, but the coolness ends in an instant with Pearl Harbor. Johnson enlists, actually he activates his Naval Reserve Commission, and Rayburn thinks he's going to war, into combat in the Pacific. The day that Lyndon Johnson and I wrote that Rayburn's heart melted toward Johnson in an instant, as a father's heart melts towards an estranged son when the son is in danger. The day that Lyndon Johnson leaves for the Pacific, he writes Sam Rayburn a one-page letter. Sam Rayburn folds it up very small and puts it in his wallet. When he dies 20 years later, the curator of the Rayburn Library has to inventory the contents of his desk. And he opens a special drawer in which Rayburn kept the letters from his mother and the letter from Lyndon Johnson. And the curator wrote Johnson that Rayburn had carried that letter in his wallet for many, many years, actually apparently until shortly before he died. And the folds of that were still in his wallet. So Johnson realizes when he gets to the Senate that he has something that no one else has. Senators need the House of Representatives. Say you need a public work for your state. Say your constituents are demanding that you get a dam built. It's not enough that the Senate authorizes the dam. The House has to authorize the dam. Say you get a legislation passed in the Senate. The House can rewrite it. Johnson realizes that he is the only senator who can go to the man who rules the House of Representatives and ask for action on senators' bills. And he immediately in awareness of this, you can see it in the memos and letters in the Lyndon Johnson Library, memos and letters coming into Johnson from very senior senators, committee chairmen saying, Lyndon, the House, my dam authorization bill is stalled in the House. Can you put a word in the Speaker's ear? Or, Lyndon, I don't like what House Ways and Means did to my appropriations bill. Can you say something to Mr. Sam? And Johnson, of course, whenever he does these favors for senators, he makes sure that they know it and they owe him something in return. That's a source of power. Maybe there's one other source of power I can sum up in a quick paragraph, which is cash, campaign contributions. Johnson is a political genius, and he realizes he has another thing that no other senator has. He is the only senator who is familiar with two different groups of people. The very conservative, reactionary Texas oil men, natural gas men, contractors in Texas who need federal contracts and laws and are willing to pay in the form of campaign contributions to get them. And he also knows the liberal representatives and senators from the Northeast who need campaign contributions. He makes sure that the Texans know they should contribute only through him, and he makes sure that it becomes known in Washington that he is the source and the only source of Texas campaign contributions. If there's one scene that sums this up, it's in the book. It's in 1952. Johnson isn't running for the Senate, but a lot of other senators are. One of his lawyers, Arthur Staling, walks into that big living room of the ranch on the Perdinellis, and Johnson is sitting there saying, I've got 20 for him and 20 for him and 30 for him. That's a source of power. And Johnson used all these powers with a ruthlessness that made them even more effective. Here is another quote from Lyndon Johnson speaking about himself. I'm just like a fox. I can see the jugular in any man and go for it, but I always keep myself in rein. I keep myself on a leash, just like you would an animal. Well, in that self-assessment, Lyndon Johnson is only partially correct. There are more than a few examples in this book of how he let himself off the leash. In those same very few first months in the Senate, he sees the jugular in a man and destroys him with what he sees. The man's name is Leland Olds. He's an idealistic New Dealer who had worked for Franklin Roosevelt for a long time, going back to when Roosevelt was governor of New York. His field was public power, hydroelectric power from rivers, natural gas power. He believed very deeply that while private companies were entitled to profits from a natural resource, they shouldn't be allowed to gouge the public just because they had a monopoly on it, since, as another New Dealer wrote, who owns a river if not the people? Roosevelt believed the same way. When he's governor of New York, he makes Olds chairman of the New York State Power Authority, and when Roosevelt becomes president, he makes Olds chairman of the Federal Power Commission. Now it's 1949. Olds has served 2 5-year terms as chairman of the Federal Power Commission, and he has to be renominated, confirmed by the Senate, for another term. President Truman, who admires and respects Olds as much as Roosevelt did, has renominated him. And almost Johnson's first assignment from these Texas natural gas men is to defeat Olds' renomination. This seems almost impossible to do because most of the senators had gotten to know Olds. You know, if you're a senator, you have to deal with the Federal Power Commission in one way or another during your career. And even the most conservative Republican senators had come to admire Olds' fairness, and everybody liked him. So Johnson takes another route. He finds Olds' jugular. He learns that 25 and 30 years before, when Olds was a young man, he was a reporter for a wire service. Now, the wire service, as I suppose everyone knows, is like the Associated Press is a wire service. If you're a reporter, you work for it, you write a story, and any subscribing paper is entitled to print that story, and if, should they choose to do so, to put your byline on top of it. I think the Federated, Olds' wire service that he works for is called the Federated Press. It has, as I recall, 81 clients. 80 are mainstream newspapers. One is the Communist Daily Worker. Lyndon Johnson has his assistants go through every issue of the Daily Worker during the 1920s. They find 54 times where the byline by Leland Olds appears in the Daily Worker. Johnson has those 54 pages photographed. He takes them around to senators in the privacy of their offices and convinces them that Olds was a communist and may still be a communist. Then he gets himself made chairman of the subcommittee that's dealing with Olds' renomination. No one wants the job. It's easy for him to get it. Everyone thinks the hearings are going to be pro forma. And he destroys Olds with his cross-examination, demanding what he meant by these articles that he had written 25 years before. Then he gives a speech on the floor of the Senate. The key line that Johnson says is, what do we want, a commissioner or a commissar? And the Senate votes Leland Olds down. Olds is really destroyed by this. He's literally destroyed. He's 58 years old. He's been a civil servant all his life. He has almost no savings. He's never going to get another decent job in government. He can't get a job with any company in the industry that he's given his life to learning about, because who would dare to hire a communist? He lives the rest of his life as a poor man. And poverty was really not the worst of it. His wife, Maud, who sat in those subcommittee hearings listening to Olds being called a traitor and a communist, couldn't believe that the women in her little neighborhood in Washington that she had thought were her friends wouldn't talk to her anymore when they saw her on the street, either because they didn't want to or were afraid to be seen talking to someone who was married to a communist. And the rest of his life, without going into it, the rest of her life without going into it, is just a series of one nervous breakdown after another. Of all the unpleasant things that I had to learn about when I was researching this book on Lyndon Johnson's life, and there were a lot of unpleasant things, the worst one for me was to hear about a scene that occurred outside the open door of that subcommittee room where Johnson has just destroyed Olds with his cross-examination. Olds knows what's happened to him, and he's standing there stunned with his wife and with one young assistant, Melvin Van Scoyac. Johnson comes out and puts his arm around Olds' shoulders and says, "Lee, we're still friends, aren't we? There's nothing personal in this, you know. It's just politics." Well, that was politics, part of Lyndon Johnson's style of politics, and it was very effective. After that, a lot of older senators were a little wary of Johnson, a little afraid of him. And of course, fear creates more power. As leader, Johnson displayed the same ruthlessness. Even men who were pragmatic, who thought they knew Washington, who thought they understood how power worked, saw there was something special about Lyndon Johnson. Scoop Jackson of the state of Washington, who worked with Johnson for 25 years in the House of Representatives and the Senate, once tried to explain the difference between President Kennedy and President Johnson if they needed a senator's vote on a bill. Jackson said that Kennedy, quote, would explain precisely why the bill was so important and why he needed the senator's support. But if the senator said that his constituency simply wouldn't allow him to vote that way, Jackson wrote, Kennedy would finally say he was sorry they couldn't agree, but he understood. Lyndon Johnson, Scoop Jackson would say, Lyndon Johnson wouldn't understand. He would refuse to understand. He would, and these are Jackson's words, quote, he would charm you or knock your block off or bribe you or threaten you, anything he had to get your vote, and he'd get it. That was the difference. He'd get it. So when Lyndon Johnson became leader, he had the powers he had found and created and the ruthlessness with which he was willing to use these powers. And what did he do with them? What did he do with this power that he obtained by such methods, by such means? Only this. He broke the dam that the Senate had thrown up for 20 years against every form of liberal legislation. He passed the first significant housing for the poor measures that had been passed. He got the first increase in the minimum wage in years, the first expansion of Social Security. He added disability benefits to Social Security. He passed bills of which liberals had been dreaming for 20 years and had all but given up hope of passing. And with these bills, Lyndon Johnson improved the lives of millions and tens of millions of people. Most important of all, in my opinion, he passed the Civil Rights Bill in 1957, the first civil rights bill since Reconstruction, the first civil rights bill that had been passed in 82 years. During that time, hundreds of civil rights bills had been introduced on Capitol Hill. Scores had passed the House of Representatives. Not one had passed the Senate. You know, we all learn Lord Acton's axiom, all power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely. The more I learn about power, the less sure I am that that axiom is always true. But I'll tell you what I think is always true, what power always does. Power reveals. Power unmasks what was underneath all along. Someone asked me at dinner tonight, do I feel that Lyndon Johnson always wanted to pass civil rights? I said, I think I do, and the reason I always felt that he did was something he did. You know, when Johnson was 20, he's going to a teacher's college down in Texas. He's very poor. He has to drop out of school for a year to earn money to continue. And what he does is teach at a Mexican-American school down in Cotulla. And the children who were there talk about how Johnson spared no effort to teach them. I wrote, no teacher had ever cared if these children learned or not. This teacher cared. He spanks the boys. He thinks it's important that they speak only English. He spanks the boys, tongue lashes the girls if he hears them speaking Spanish. He persuades a school board to give them bats and balls like the white teams when they won't authorize a debating team. He makes himself a debating coach and persuades the fathers, the men who migrant workers, the fathers of these children, to take days off from work to drive the children to the debates. But we could say, and I said at dinner tonight, that you could say that's just an example of Lyndon Johnson always trying to do the best job he could no matter what job he had, and that was a characteristic of Johnson. The reason I always felt that I knew he always wanted to help was that he didn't just teach the children, he taught the janitor. The janitor at that school is named Tomas Coronado. He says that Johnson wanted him to learn English, so he bought him a textbook, and every afternoon after school, they would sit on the steps outside the school, and Coronado says, Johnson would pronounce the word, I would repeat. Johnson would spell, I would repeat. I thought he always wanted to do that. It's not only depths, and Lyndon Johnson, when he gets power, the cruelty and brutality he can show to people is also unmasked. It's also as bad as anything you can imagine. But it's not only depths that power reveals. Throughout Lyndon Johnson's life, there had been hints of what he might do with great power should he ever succeed in attaining it. hints of compassion for the downtrodden and of a passion to raise them up, hints that he might use power not only to manipulate others, but to help others, to help moreover those who most needed help. And now, once he had acquired power in the Senate, that compassion shines forth at last. In order to understand what Lyndon Johnson did, the significance of what he did in 1957, you have to appreciate the magnitude of the problem, or maybe a better word would be the depth of the problem. I really didn't understand it at first. It seemed to me that one thing that I wasn't understanding, well, there were a lot of things that I wasn't understanding, but one thing that I wasn't understanding at all was this fact. In 1956, the last election before 1957, of course, out of 6 million black Americans of voting age in the South, only about 1 million managed to register to vote. 1 out of 6, that's bad enough. There are whole counties in the South in which no black American has ever been able to register. But there was another figure that I didn't understand. Out of the 1 million who had registered in 1956, something less than 600,000 of them had actually cast votes. In other words, more than 400,000 of the million, almost half, had gone through all the difficulties to register to vote, but hadn't actually cast a vote. Now, for a black woman or a black man or woman to register took such great courage. What were the conditions, the factors that could make people who could do that, who had the guts to register, not exercise that right they had secured for themselves? So I guess what I was trying to do was to get more of a feeling for what life was like for a black American in the South who was trying to actually vote. So what I did, the United States Commission on Civil Rights held a series of hearings throughout the South in 1958, 59, and 60. They were on voting, and they had a lot of witnesses. I had read all their testimony, but the testimony focused largely on the actual process of registration, not voting. The hearings before the registration examiners, the unfair oral questions of the how many bubbles are there in a bar of soap type. The written forms that were so difficult to fill out were simply unavailable when someone asked for them. I wanted to know what life was like for African Americans trying to vote, to actually vote. What was life like outside the process of voting? What was daily life like, if you will? I wanted to try to get a feeling for that. So what I was doing was simply going through the list of witnesses at these commission hearings and trying to locate them and talk to them, those that were still alive. Of course, it was already 40 years since they had since they had testified, and a lot weren't. It was after I started to do that that I began to understand the depth of the problem and the nobility of what Lyndon Johnson had done. Began to understand aspects I had never really gotten. I remember talking to a man named Aaron Sellers in Bullock County, Alabama. Well, actually, it's a one-sided conversation. Mr. Sellers, by this time, was completely deaf, so he couldn't hear my questions. Luckily, his daughter, Gladys Sellers, was visiting from Washington Heights in Manhattan, so I would ask her the question, and she would tell Aaron, her father, the question, and he would talk to me. And when I asked why he had been able to get people registered and then he hadn't voted, he said, well, the white people in town kept a list of the names of who was trying to vote, and they kept the list in their pockets for ready reference. So I said, well, what would they use the list for? And then I started to get a real education. I can't tell you all about it tonight. I'll tell you just about crop loans. People who are on that list couldn't get crop loans. Now, if you're a poor farmer in the South, you need in the spring a loan from a bank to buy your seeds and the fertilizer to plant your crops. And then in Bullock County was cotton and peanut. Without that loan, you couldn't plant for the next year. You wouldn't have a harvest to sell. You wouldn't have any income coming in. You would have to pack up your wife and children in many cases and get into your rundown car and drive off, often with no place to go. If you wanted to vote in the South, that was something that was facing you. I remember calling a woman named Margaret Frost. You know, I always ask, no matter what else they tell me, I ask to describe the room that the scene was occurring, and you never know what's going to happen when you ask people to describe the room. And she was telling me that the Board of Registrars in her town, this is the scene that opens Master of the Senate, they met in the county clerk's office after hours, and there was the desks that the clerks sat at, and then there was a counter that the clerks were at. And now the registrars are sitting behind the counter, and in front of them, Margaret Frost says, was her and I think the two other black people who were trying to register. And I said, so what was there, chairs? And she said, no, there were no chairs. And I asked why. I don't remember her exact words, but the idea is because the registrars knew that this hearing wasn't going to take very long. Then she said, maybe you want to speak to my husband. Her husband was David Frost, and he had registered to vote some years before. And he told me the story with which I opened the book. He had managed to register, but then he said a white man had told him, quote, the white folks are the nigger's friends as long as the nigger stays in his place. But that if he actually tried to cast a vote, quote, I had got out of my place if I was going to vote along with the white man. And he told me how when the whites in the town learned he was planning to actually vote, despite the threats, a car filled with men had stopped in front of his house one night and shot out the porch lights. And he told me how, cowering inside, he had thought of calling the police until as the car drove away, he saw it was a police car. A police car. So where do you turn if you can't turn to the police? I came to realize that I was writing about a people who had no place to turn. Nothing that a state that could be done within that state was going to help them. They needed a law. They needed a national law. While the Civil Rights Bill of 1957 is a very weak law indeed, the important thing is that it was passed and was the basis for other laws. In order to appreciate what Lyndon Johnson did for civil rights in 1957, you have to understand the difficulty in doing what he did. It seems just impossible. I said I'm interested in power and legislative power. If you're interested in legislative power, it seems absolutely impossible that anybody is going to get a civil rights bill through that Senate. The number changed from year to year, if I remember correctly, and I may not, of the 9 most powerful Senate committees in 1957, Southerners were chairman of 7. They had all the power in the Senate. William S. White of the Times wrote that the Senate is the South's unending revenge for Gettysburg. Not just revenge, unending revenge. He wrote that the Senate is the only place in the country where the South didn't lose the war. He was right. And as long as the South didn't lose it in the Senate, it hadn't really lost the war. To learn how Lyndon Johnson got the votes to pass that civil rights bill, it seemed to me like he was getting them one vote at a time. You can almost trace it hour by hour, not just by memos and letters, but by those little pink telephone message slips that secretaries would bring into Johnson. Senator Russell is on the phone. He says he'll do this if so-and-so happens. Senator Humphrey is on the phone. He won't do that. To watch how Lyndon Johnson got the votes to pass that bill, by all the things I try to describe in the book, the maneuvers on the floor, the maneuvers in the cloakroom, was for me getting a lesson in so many nuances of legislative power that I had no idea even existed. And it's a lesson in something more also, in determination. You know, I end a lot of sections in the civil rights fight with the same sentence. My editor got really angry at me. He says, you're repeating the same sentence over and over again. I said, I'm doing it on purpose. What I do is over and over again, Johnson comes to some obstacle that seems absolutely insurmountable. He retreats back to the Pedernales, seemingly beaten. And what he does down there is think. And after I describe this obstacle that the South has put up, I said, these are the sentences my editor didn't like. But a civil rights bill had to be passed, and a civil rights bill was going to be passed. Lyndon Johnson was the greatest champion in the halls of government that black Americans and indeed all Americans of color had during the 20th century. Indeed, as I wrote, with the single exception of Lincoln, he was the greatest champion with a white skin that they had in the history of the Republic. This is when he's in the Senate. The life of Lyndon Johnson is, for me, a very poignant life. The story of his boyhood is just sad, poignant. So is a lot of the rest of his life. But his time in the Senate was not sad, which makes that, in a way, the most poignant thing of all, because he wasn't content to stay there, but wanted something else, which he got. Lady Bird Johnson was to write in her diary, "Those 12 years in the Senate were the happiest 12 years of our lives," and they were. Lyndon Johnson was born to be there. For the United States, they were very productive years. When you look back at the Senate of the United States during the first 2.25 centuries of its existence, of the Republic's existence, after the days of Webster, Clay, and Calhoun in the 1840s and 1850s, after the Civil War, the Senate worked really during only one period, a single 6-year period, 1955 through the end of 1960, in which Lyndon Johnson was its leader. It really worked then. Lyndon Johnson was indeed what I call him, master of the Senate. Well, I try to keep this speech short, but if I could do things short, I wouldn't always be writing 1,000-page books. Thank you very much.
Bob has agreed to take some questions. If you would line up at the microphone here, up there, and if you would, identify yourself.
Hi, my name's Reed Saras. I'm a senior at the college.
Yes.
Thank you very much for your work, Mr. Carroll.
Thank you.
I don't want you to give away the end of your book or anything like this, but the question that you ask in the second volume, you juxtapose the 1948 election
Right.
with the speech before the joint session of Congress saying, "We shall overcome."
Right.
And you ask if the means justify the ends.
Right.
And I know it's a rhetorical question, and maybe you haven't resolved it yourself because you're still working through it, but what's your leaning on this with regards to Lyndon Johnson?
Yeah, that's the right question. I haven't worked it all through. I would say, people always want to say, do the means justify the ends? With Lyndon Johnson, I think it's more complicated. I would say the life of Lyndon Johnson raises inescapably, in its deepest form, the question of the relationship of means and ends, because Lyndon Johnson, of course, the We Shall Overcome speech, the Civil Rights Acts, the Great Society, he brought to realization most of the most noble liberal aspirations of the 20th century. But he wouldn't have been in a position, you talk about the 1948 election, a lot of people tried to say he didn't really steal it, he stole it. He used the means, some of which I talk about in this book, in the Senate, but he would never have been in position to achieve those ends if it hadn't been for those means. So I'm still working that out, actually.
Yes, sir.
I don't know if I'll work it out. Yes? Yes,
My name is
sir.
Josh Good. I'm a recent graduate of the Divinity School here, and found very thought-provoking your suggestion that political power reveals.
Yes.
Any thoughts about how political power might differ from the power held by a business CEO or a journalist or an educator,
Yeah.
religious leader?
Yes. Political power affects our lives in a more direct and all-encompassing way. When I talk about Robert Moses, I try to put it in a very small context. If you live in Manhattan and you're driving up the East River Drive in Manhattan to go across the Triborough Bridge, you may notice as you pass 96th Street that the bridge comes down across the river in 96th Street. So why are you driving all the way up to 125th Street and then coming back down to 96th Street, where I think is 4.5 extra miles? Well, the reason, of course, is that William Randolph Hearst in 1934, when Moses is trying to build that bridge, owned tenement houses at 125th Street. Before the Depression, they had been very profitable. Now it's a depression, people can't pay their rents, and he wants to get rid of them. He wants the city to condemn them. And his price for supporting, Hearst has 3 newspapers in New York then, his price for supporting the Triborough Bridge is that it come down at 125th Street. So every time you drive those 4 miles, that's political power. You might say also, every time a low-income student gets to go to college on one of Lyndon Johnson's programs, that's political power. And on the other side, and I haven't even mentioned it tonight, every time someone died a needless death, or suffered a needless wound in Vietnam, that was political power. I think there's a vast difference between political power in a democracy and other forms of power. Yes, sir.
Hi, my name is Chris Steele. I'm a Master of Public Policy student here at the Kennedy School of Government.
Yes,
Thank you very
yes.
much for being here, Mr. Caro. My first question is, I just finished Master of the Senate this summer, and it was just a fantastic book. I think this is a bit of a premature question, but I'm wondering when the next volume is going to be finished. And if we have to wait another decade for hearing about the vice presidency and the presidency. And then secondly, I'm very intrigued by the close working relationship you have with your wife, and I wonder if you'd say a few more words about that.
Sure. Let me say that last first, because Ina isn't here tonight. I wish she was so I could introduce you to her. As those of you who have read my acknowledgments know, the only person who ever works with me on my book is my wife, who also writes her own book. She's actually finishing, although with the Caros, finishing is an elastic term, I told Alex. She's in the latter stages of finishing her second book now. Ina is really, she's a medieval historian, and while I was working on The Power Broker, she was doing her PhD thesis, but I got hurt and I had to stay in bed for about a year, and I needed someone to try to do research for me. So she learned her way around the courthouse. We were then doing records on how Jones Beach was put together. And she's been working for me ever since. In the Hill Country, of course, she's really invaluable because Alex said something about me being a city boy. Because I was a city boy, the people in the Hill Country really didn't trust me, and I needed to talk to these very elderly women. If you didn't have electricity, when Johnson went to Congress in 1937, you had to be in your late 70s or 80s, and I really couldn't get them to talk to me, and Ina would go and make friends with them. By the time I came, they would be there waiting to talk. She's really a great researcher. Your other question is when I'm going to be done. Whatever I said, why would you believe that? I'm doing it as fast as I can. Yes, ma'am. Oh, sure, yes.
Hi, Mr. Caro. My name is Shira Pinnis. I'm a junior at the college.
Yes.
I was wondering, you spoke tonight about how seniority was so important in the Senate before Lyndon Johnson came to power. And you also spoke about how the only years that the Senate really worked was when Lyndon Johnson was in power.
Yeah.
So I was wondering whether you think that Lyndon Johnson instituted any long-term changes in the structure of the Senate and the way that it works that lasted till today and affected the way the Senate runs today.
That's a great question. I think the answer, although it's such a broad question, I may be overlooking something, is that the things that Johnson ran the Senate with were so personal to him that they didn't really outlive him. Part was just the force of his personality, his ability to bargain with people. Part was had always been in the Senate something called the unanimous consent agreement, which it would take me 3 days to explain to you. But Johnson, if I could remember the details, but Johnson made it an instrument of power. Now, they still have the unanimous consent agreements in the Senate, but they're no longer used the same way. As soon as Johnson left, although other Senate leaders were really outstanding and very respected leaders like Mike Mansfield and all. The Senate, when Johnson was, when Johnson was leader, they would really be creating legislation. They would take bills that the Eisenhower White House sent over and rewrite them completely. So they were Senate bills, and those were the bills that would pass. I don't think any of that, I may be overlooking something, but I don't think any of it survived him.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Hi there, my name is Josiah Pertz.
Hi,
I'm a
Joe.
junior at the college.
Yes.
I wanted to ask you about your interviewing style and specifically how you got people to recount very distant memories, and also as a journalist how you dealt with those memories as told and whether you question any of the accuracy of those memories and how you dealt with that in print.
Sure. Well, you always question it. You always try and check it with other people. Interviews are very tricky, very tricky things. If there are other people in a meeting, I try to talk to all of them. What I also do is I go back, let's say you had, these are not the correct names, but let's say you had a meeting with McNamara, Rusk, Walt Rostow, and someone else. After you interview them, then you would go back to Rusk and say, McNamara says this, as I say, these are not the right names. You said so-and-so, how do you square that? Then you go to the third person and say, and then you go back. I spend a lot of time recreating meetings. I don't know that I have an interviewing style except for one thing, which I'll tell you. The two greatest interviewers in fiction are Inspector Maigret and George Smiley and John le Carré. But their technique, which was always hard for me because I always talked too much, was to shut up and just let till the other person filled the silences. To make himself stop talking, Smiley, who liked to talk also, would take his glasses off and polish his glasses on his necktie until the guy started talking again. Maigret would start to clean his pipe. What I do, if you looked in my interview notebooks, you'd see the words, shut up, a lot. Yes, sir.
Hi, Mr. Carroll. My name is John Marigus, and I'm an alumnus and I'm a writer. I appreciated your prologue remarks about how you sit in Litauer and think, and how you changed your view of politics and power. And personality and power is your theme tonight. First, as a writer, how did you, because you write very differently than the average biographer and historian, how do you think about what you want to describe to your reader? And then putting together the different confluence of influences that you write about when you write about this person. And secondly, since you mentioned every time Lyndon Johnson did something good for the civil rights, we should remember that. But also, you said every time a needless death occurred in Vietnam, we should remember that. And Johnson put such a stamp and change on American politics, not always for the better. And how would you talk about his legacy today, and not necessarily the good legacy? Because you beautifully describe his usage of power.
Well, those are terrific questions. These are all terrific questions. How would I describe it? I don't know. Excuse me. I don't know how I describe his legacy. All you can really say that I know I feel right now about his presidency is that it's a watershed presidency, and I use that in the exact meaning of the term, which is the watershed is the continental divide. On one side of it, the waters run this way, and the other side, they run the other way. I do feel, from my reading, that America was a different place when Lyndon Johnson left office in January 1969 than it was when he took office in 1963. How much of that was due to him, how much of his personality, how much of it was due to the forces of the time, I haven't decided yet. But certainly it's not like Roosevelt's presidency when you say, what is the arc of Roosevelt's presidency? He brought the country through a Great Depression and a great and good war. With Lyndon Johnson on the one side, you have the Great Society, you have the great Civil Rights Acts, you have all those things. On the other side, you have the credibility gap, the mistrust of government, which people which really dates back to Lyndon Johnson. And Vietnam. It's a very complicated story. Your first question about what I try to think of when I'm trying to write, that you never really know what you're trying to think. I have one thing I always try to ask myself, can the reader see what's happening? You have to spend time describing the place, describing the people. It's not just enough to keep putting facts down. Sometimes you're judged for one award or another, so you have to read at least a few pages, and sometimes a lot of nonfiction books. And you see in some cases there's been terrific research, but the writers seem to feel that all that mattered was to get that research down, one fact after the other. But nonfiction that endures, to me, is written at the same level as fiction. Francis Parkman, Gibbon, people like that, they're writing at a very high level. I can't write at that higher level, but I do think the same things that are important in fiction writing are important in nonfiction. Yes, sir.
I'm Matt Bosch, and I'm a first year at the college.
Yes, Matt.
And this past Saturday, there was a forum here about John F. Kennedy and his legacy, and there was a lot of speculation as to what would have happened if Kennedy had lived and filled out his term. And I'm sure the group was quite biased, but the general feeling was that all of Johnson's programs, A Great Society, Civil Rights Acts, etc., were a result of Kennedy's vision that Johnson just ended up implementing after his death. And it seems to me that you might not totally buy into that.
Well,
I mean,
I haven't. That's certainly an argument, that's being advanced. It's something that I'm doing. I'm doing research on that. I don't know how I'm going to come down on that. I'm not sure I agree with all of that.
Okay.
Hi, Terrence Burke with WGBH.
Yes,
Mr. Carroll, would people like Robert Moses and Lyndon Johnson have been able to achieve their power in today's world of the 24-hour news cycle? And just talk a little bit about these two powerful men and their relationship with the press, please. Thank you.
Well, would Lyndon Johnson and Robert Moses be able to? People are always asking me that. In New York, there can't be a there could never be a Robert Moses today. We have all these processes in place to prevent that. But, it's the nature. People forget that when Robert Moses came to power in 1934, everyone was saying New York will never be able to build anything big. The government will never be able to build anything. The city was not literally, because they didn't call it bankrupt, but it was bankrupt. All the public works projects were stopped. The automobile age had started in 1914. The city had been able in all those years to build, I used to know this, I think 13 miles of arterial highway. Couldn't build bridges. Everyone said no one can build. Moses comes to power, and in 1 year he started the Triborough Bridge, finished the Henry Hudson Bridge, built whatever I say in the book, 217 playgrounds, 143 miles of parkways. It's the nature of, if Robert Moses came along today, he wouldn't be able to use the same methods, but it's the nature of political genius to find a way to do something that no one has been able to do before. I wouldn't know with either Robert Moses or Lyndon Johnson what to do. Hopefully I could find out how they did it and describe it later. But there will always be leaders coming along. Each one will be different, I believe.
Take two more here and there.
Yes, sir.
Good evening. My name is Angel Pascual Ramsey. I'm a graduate student here at the Kennedy School.
Yeah.
I have a question for you about the psychology of power. I remember reading an interview with President Clinton soon after he had left office, in which he said that he was more idealistic after having left office than before he went into office.
I don't know.
He was more idealistic.
More idealistic? Okay.
And that really struck me. It surprised me because it seems to be counterintuitive that when you get to this kind of high level of politics, you come across vested interests, you have to become more of a pragmatic, and it's just the ruthlessness of the whole thing. And when I've read some of your ideas about Johnson, and when you were going over them right now, this same theme kind of seemed to ring true again. That there seems to be something in some great leaders, certainly not in all, that once they have kind of accomplished this great power, they seem to, in a way, have some of these very idealistic kind of drive in them. And I was wondering if you could tell us how and why you think this happens, or explore the idea a little bit more.
Well, that's such a broad question. I don't think I can tell you how it happens in leaders. I think some leaders have it and some leaders don't. I've happened to write about two men who wanted to change the world, So in some ways, maybe they changed it for the worse, in some ways for the better, but they left a lasting impact. That some people come to power and they don't want to change the world. All they want is to be in power. Sometimes they want to use the power for something, and sometimes they just want the power. Each is, I think, is different. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, I'm
Hi.
Laura McClure. I'm a Neiman Fellow here this year on
Yes,
leave
ma'am.
from the AP in Washington.
Okay.
My question is sort of a journalist question, which is there a question or a moment that you would like to, knowing what you know now, ask Johnson if you had the opportunity?
Well, there are a lot. I guess if I had one question, I'd like to ask him about his relationship with his father, because I think it's the thing that made Lyndon, it's the single saddest thing, and it's sort of a defining thing in Johnson's life. And I've heard about it from his brother and one of his sisters, you know, and maids who were in the house and all. But I really would like to hear about it from him. Thank you all very much.
Please join us tomorrow for the panel.
I've read all this book.
Bought this before grads.